Okay, thanks, Neil.
Okay, Debbie. So let's just look at some of the issues that are raised there. I was very struck that although people talked about the impact of technology, there's a lot of debate about how this is all going to go forward. And Julie mentioned that she'd seen some changes in 10 months that would otherwise have taken 10 years. And the use of technology and the way that it empowers individuals who are taking ownership of what they have to do. I would just wonder if that's going to lead to perhaps some of the delayering that Dan mentioned. For those of us who followed manufacturing in the 90s when there was a lot of business process re-engineering, I remember a trade union official coming up to me delighted as he began to realize that it was his blue-collar members operating these new computers and maintaining the high-tech machines that were going to keep their jobs, and the white-collar managers who'd given them a hard time all during the Thatcher years that were about to lose theirs. Dan, you mentioned the importance of middle management line capability, but isn't some of that line management under threat as people look at the way folk have been enabled to do and deliver their jobs? Dan, what's your thoughts on that?
Right, yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, I think the point about the, what I mentioned, delayering, I think in previous recessions, we've seen that have an impact on the way in which organisations build skills in the organisation. So the way in which they build, foster and develop people's careers. And we've seen that that kind of delayering kind of removed the infrastructure for careers, because there were no real ways in which people could move and progress through the organisation because there weren't those stepping stones. But then when that recession, during that recession or towards the end of that recession, I think employers realised that they did need to do something about developing people's skills and think about careers, because it gave them lots of agility, it gave them lots of ability to respond to the changes they were experiencing. So really what I was saying was I think that organisations shouldn't lose sight of the importance of having an understanding of the type of work they need to do, the skills that employees have, trying to match those two things together, trying to have development in place so that they can enable their staff to develop a range of skills that enables that kind of business and flexibility and ability to respond to change they're going to need. I think that was the argument that I was trying to make.
And Julie, I mean, your work in things like further and higher education, you've seen the pandemic be quite disruptive to the models. It's not just that people have had to figure out how to deliver what they were delivering before, but it's opened up a whole debate about how they might deliver things differently in the future through technology and things. What do you think the long-term impact, say, in something like further and higher education might be?
Well, it's interesting, and I was listening. Well, as Dan was talking about sort of enabling change, and and I talked about all of the change that's happened in the last 10 months. I think people have pivoted quite significantly, but I still have a big question mark about the quality of that pivot and the longevity of it. So, for example, universities did an incredible job at getting everybody online very, very quickly. Flipping from lecture theatres to Zoom lectures, but a lot of it has been, lecture capture, recording a lecture and presenting it, online. And there's been lots of discussion and debate about the student experience around that and how that works. And I think that what has happened, I think, over the last 12 months is, one, universities have moved very quickly online, but whether that is good enough for a long-term sustainable teaching and learning model, in many instances, still a big question mark. At the same time, you've seen a lot of innovative entrepreneurs seeing the opportunity. You could go, any of us could write a training program, go on Udemy, publish it, and charge £20 a pop, and it's open to the whole world. So we can all become, curators and programmers of content now and put it online in a way that you couldn't have done in the past. But there are some organizations who are doing this really, really well. and really growing their presence, on the online space. OPMs are thinking differently about how they deliver. Organisations like Upgrad, which is an amazing Indian business that's doing some of this stuff, and really, I think, will really disrupt this marketplace in the longer term. Why do you need to go to university for 3 years to sit in your bedroom and study when I can do it online much quicker or over a longer period in a much more flexible way, with a sort of digital first enabled platform? So I think that actually what we've seen is a pivot to deal with the here and now, but there is still a lot of a way to go for many organizations to make this business as usual. And in order to make it business as usual, I think there has to be, as Dan talked about, that organizational ambition to change radically in the longer term. And I do worry a little bit that as we come out of lockdown, as we go back in to sort of normality, some organizations will feel, well, we've done that, we can just go back to old ways. And I do worry that misses the zeitgeist of young people who are looking for a very different thing, customers who are now looking and expecting a very different thing.
We've had a question from Peter Whitehouse just asking, what do we think about the story of Octopus Energy, who claim to have no HR or IT department? Now, that obviously wouldn't stand up to examination, but it may mean that they have an algorithm instead of an HR department, and their IT is bought off the shelf, like all of us, simply working on Microsoft Teams and changing our address. But Dan, what do you think about people who, organizations that try and make a virtue of taking out anything that might be peculiar to their organization and trying to live on common platforms of some kind?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, my thing is, I think like people drive kind of performance. I mean, a lot of our kind of success as kind of economy is based on kind of knowledge industries. So the people are the kind of the key asset in that. So I think you need something within an organization to motivate people, to engage people. I mean, you could possibly have an organization with no HR, or if you had great, fantastic line managers, but quite often people don't. So it's really a question of where do people get, or how do organizations create environments where people can give their best, where they can be innovative, where they can feel supported, where they can be motivated, where they can actually develop to their full potential. How is that being achieved? So I think that's the central question. There may be different ways to achieve that, but kind of saying there's no HR kind of suggests that that sort of that support isn't there, and I think that is worrying to me. But I think I think that's the central thing for me is you need to get the best out of people, and
Can I ask a question about, I mentioned in my introduction, those people who can't work from home, have to go out and deliver services, blue collar, nurses, midwives, etc. We do a lot of work with midwives. And obviously, one of the things in the pandemic, which may have had to be explained to ministers, was that maternity units couldn't simply be closed because women carried on having babies. But we've watched an extraordinary transformation in supervision, the use of technology, the way that they communicate directly with mothers, which is really quite strongly changing the model and challenging some of the supervision models. At the same time, I've had 2 visits today, one from an electrician and one from a plumber. And both of them turned up with vans that had more technology than the Starship Enterprise. But by the time they'd left the house, they knew what their next job was. They'd ordered all the parts, and they'd been living online from their van for a couple of years. So I was fascinated by the way in which they'd made their adaptations. Is there an element of the office just catching up? Julie, what do you think?
I think there is, and I think it goes back to Dan's point around, the sort of maybe the confusion between organisational inertia and employee inertia. When I sort of learned my craft around change management, you're always told about this sticky layer in the middle that will get in the way of making change happen and making change stick. And actually, when you spend time in organizations and you talk with different teams, actually, this is something that is sort of myth and legend perpetrated by the organization, whatever the organization is, rather than by individuals. And I think that there is something about organizations historically have not really wanted to make change happen, because there is a comfort almost in the sort of historical position of what and who they are. So what you actually then find is organizations who talk a good story around change, but actually their sort of systems, their processes, their culture is almost treated like laws of physics, that if we make a change, the world will come crashing down because, something becomes unstable. So I do think that is a real challenge for organizations. And I think what we're seeing, I think it's partly driven by the last 12 months and the experience that everybody's had about what we can actually do. I think it's also been driven actually by, the Gen Y and beyond thinking about what they're looking for out of life, the experience rather than the career, the changing careers multiple times, the uncertainty around technology and whether our job will still be here in 5 or 10 years' time. So I think there's a cadre of people coming into and taking up middle management roles in the workforce today who think differently and don't have those long career expectations in one job. The career is about what I do for me and where I take myself. And I think that changes radically how people want to work and their willingness to sort of to get up and go somewhere else if they're not getting what they need in the organization that they're in. So I think I think it is catching up, but I think it's also about empowerment of people who think differently than maybe the generation before.
So Chris Atkinson's asking, do the panel have any tips on creating and encouraging a culture based on front and back office? Dan, is that how you think about offices, front and back? Have we slipped into thinking about that instead of thinking about teams? Or how can you make a culture that really connects those two? Dan?
I think that's one of the kind of central challenges that I think Julie alluded to in her piece about, how do you stop this situation of kind of remote working now, remote hybrid working in the future, becoming like a two-tier workforce, where one part of the workforce gets to kind of work from home on a kind of very sort of flexible basis, and the other part of the workforce is, frontline, has to go to an office, has to wherever they work. And how do you stop that being a kind of division between those two different parts of your organization? I mean, silos sort of develop very quickly in organizations and in very kind of small groups as well. So I think one of the main challenges for organizations going forward is to kind of prevent that sort of division from developing. I mean, quite often it exists already. So, I mean, it's not like a new challenge. It's perhaps just exacerbated by what the future holds. I mean, I think there's lots of, different challenges kind of facing us going forward. I mean, you mentioned technology a minute ago. I think one of the things about that is, we often kind of leap to technology as the answer. We all sit here now and think, okay, we've been working at home for, 12 months and we've got this technology and isn't it great? I don't think we've even come to really yet start to grapple with some of the challenges we're going to face moving forward into a hybrid workforce, even from a technology perspective.
And I mean, Debbie, your work in the Institute, every time I listen to your speakers, they talk about, how you create a culture that is working. What kind of cultural challenges do you think people are going to face coming out of this when people can imagine different ways of working in the future? Or what are you seeing already in the feedback from your members?
I think that the biggest challenge is having a common culture, because it is so easy to have a fractured one. And I think we'll see a greater emphasis on really strong leadership, because that's what you're going to need to bring about some sort of cohesive culture. And aligned with that very strongly, we'll need to see improvements in communication channels, I imagine, because it's no good having strong leaders who've got this wonderful vision of the culture and what it should be if they can't communicate that clearly enough to the staff. So I think it'll be about leadership. I think it'll be about communications and very clear messages on where organisations are going, so that they can align around some common bond, if you like, to try and keep everybody together. But I think it'll be very, very challenging moving forward.
Can I ask you all, just as we sort of begin to come to a close, can I ask you all to answer a question about, we've had this working from the office or working from home, but in the 5% of us who used to work remotely and all around the country before COVID, there were already trends where we might have worked part of our time at home, but we like to work near to home as opposed to going into central London all the time. And there was an exercise, I think about 10 years ago, when, for instance, some of the big councils in London took a look at, were there 50 Croydon employees trekking across London to work in Haringey and 50 going the other way? And why couldn't somebody just share an office a bit nearer to home as opposed to working at home? And that pattern is certainly visible in the shared office industry, whether it's Regis, WeWork, or any of a number of them. So what do you think about this question of opportunities to work near to home and save some of the time? So I'll start off with you first, Dan.
Yeah, I think that's one of the potential solutions. I mean, definitely some of the, the Regis and the likes of those companies have started to talk up, that kind of opportunity. And I think it is a way of, having that kind of collaboration with colleagues and that kind of sense of community without having to kind of travel to a main office. So I think that's definitely one, potential kind of solution going forwards to trying to have more sort of, to build that kind of collaboration and sense of community. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, and Julie, in the consulting world, I'm pretty sure, as you traveled around the country with your previous employers, you'd have been able to hop into their office in Birmingham if that was near, or one in Manchester. Or did you ever have anywhere near to home that was your option? Julie?
I have never had anywhere near to home, unfortunately. My family like to live as far away from civilization as is near impossible. But it's it is an interesting point, and I think you're absolutely right. The benefit of a big company is that you can have multiple offices. Historically, you've had multiple offices, but as I mentioned, even firms like Deloitte are looking at closing their offices and using sort of shared WeWorks type space instead. I think that the big change will be, just two observations. One, the big change, I think, post-COVID will be how we use office space and what we use it for. Gone are the days, I think, when I will go into the office to sit and write a report. But I'm very mindful that if I don't go into the office and I don't spend time with my team at certain points in the cycle, then, they're losing out and I'm losing out. And actually, we are just a collection of people with no shared vision, shared ambition for the organization. So I think we'll use office space in a different way to come together, to move the business forward, to think about things deeply. And we'll use our own space to do stuff that actually, you need the headspace to do it. I would be really excited about an opportunity to be able to go somewhere locally, whether it's a church hall, a community hall, the local pub during the day that would otherwise be empty, places where you could go, where the Wi-Fi is good, where you could sit at a table, you could work, and you could find out what people are doing locally. You could make new connections. You might come up with some new ideas. You might create some new opportunities. And I think that for me, it's about getting that blend between knowing when to work on your own, when to work in your office, and when to be somewhere else.
And Debbie, I mean, I think we've taken the structure of work and the structure of personal interaction and people learning from one another and water cooler moments and huddles outside meetings. We've kind of taken them for granted, but they are a very important part of individuals growing their own talent and learning to interact with other people, the team working that companies always complain students come out without enough of. How do you think that can be translated into this more perhaps flexible world? Or have you seen any really good examples? And give the last sort of word to you, Debbie.
Yeah, I think it will happen organically. I think there's hearing councils now talking about setting up touchdown points, not hot desk areas, but touchdown points where they can touch down and almost check in with colleagues from different parts of the councils in different buildings at different times. Interestingly, some of the schools I'm working with at the moment are saying that they actually prefer it because they find that the support services are far more accessible, because then and so it's a different way of working, it's a different approach. But I think that it will happen, and I think we will get these sort of photocopier moments and the ability to talk with teams as and when we want. And I think if we're lucky, it will probably be easier if we work more flexibly, and we will bump into different people at different times that maybe we would never have seen before. And I think the benefits of that could be quite huge, because you'll start to expand your ways of thinking, expand your networks and everything else.
Well, that's a very good point to end on, the strength and adaptability of people. We started off with Julie pointing to the resilience of people, and if we can end on their adaptability, their ability to cope, and perhaps with the memory that in the middle of all the assets, all the structures, all the IT, there still has to be a nice flow of human contact. So can I thank Dan Lucy, Julie Mercer and Debbie Simpson, and wish you all a good evening, a good week, a good way out of COVID, and remind you to check in with us at the end of May, when hopefully things will be a little bit clearer. So thanks to everybody, and good evening.